want you to remember this feeling right now, before you know anything, because by the end of this story, you are going to wish you could go back to not knowing what I know. My name is Maureen Whitfield, and for 31 years I thought my family was ordinary. Loud at Thanksgiving, broke more often than not, close in the way families are close when they've buried more people than they've celebrated. I thought I knew every secret worth knowing. I was wrong, and it started with something so small, so forgettable, that if you ask me to point to the exact second my life changed, I'd have to tell you it was a receipt. A single, crumpled gas station receipt that fell out of my brother-in-law's jacket pocket. That's it. That's where this begins. If you've ever had a feeling in your gut that something in your family wasn't right, a feeling you tried to talk yourself out of because it seemed disloyal, seemed crazy, seemed like too much, stay with me, because I need you to understand that sometimes the gut is right, and sometimes what it's protecting you from is worse than anything you could have imagined. Before I go further, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because I promise you, this story is going to get darker before it gets better, and I don't want you walking in halfway. Let me back up and give you the family you need to know, because none of what happens later makes sense without them. My younger sister is Angela Whitfield, before she became Angela Boyd. Growing up, Angela was the golden one. Smarter than me, prettier than me, the one who got the scholarship and moved 2 states away for college while I stayed home and took care of our mother, who was sick for the better part of a decade before she passed. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it matters later. The fact that Angela had always been the one who left, and I had always been the one who stayed, watched, noticed things. That's just who I am. I notice things. It's not a gift. Some days it feels like a curse. Angela met Richard Boyd when she was 26, at a conference for her job. She worked in logistics, coordinating shipments for a mid-sized distribution company. And Richard, from what she told me, swept her off her feet in that quiet, steady way that some men do. The way that doesn't look like sweeping at all until you're already off your feet and you can't remember agreeing to it. Richard was 34 when they met. He told her he was from a small town up north, that his parents had passed years earlier, that he didn't have much family to speak of, an uncle somewhere he wasn't close to, no siblings. He worked in insurance claims adjusting, traveled a fair amount for the job, and he was, by every account Angela ever gave me, kind, patient, the kind of man who remembered how you took your coffee after only being told once. They married 18 months after they met. Quicker than I would have liked, if I'm honest. But Angela was 30 by then, and tired of waiting for a life to start. And Richard seemed steady in a way that made the speed feel less reckless than it should have. They had 2 children, Malik, who is now 11, and Zora, who is 8. I am their aunt, and I love those children the way you love children who feel like they're partly yours even though they aren't, because I was there for both births, because I babysat more weekends than I can count, because Angela and I, despite the distance, stayed close in that particular way sisters do, where you can go 3 weeks without talking and then pick up a phone call exactly where you left off. For 9 years, the Boyd family looked, from the outside and from the inside, like a family that had figured something out that a lot of families never do. Richard was a good provider. He coached Malik's little league team for 2 seasons. He never missed a school recital for Zora, not one. And if you know anything about working fathers, you know that's rarer than it should be. I want to be fair to him here, even now, even knowing what I know. Because I think it matters that you understand this wasn't a man who seemed like a monster. Monsters who seem like monsters are easy to spot. The ones who don't, those are the ones you need to worry about, and I need you to sit with that thought for a second, because it's going to come back around by the end of this. The first crack, and I didn't even recognize it as a crack at the time, came about 1.5 years ago. Angela called me on a Tuesday night, and her voice had a texture to it I hadn't heard before. Not fear exactly. More like confusion trying very hard not to become fear. She told me Richard had started taking phone calls in the garage. Not suspicious calls, she was quick to say. Not whispering. Nothing like that. Just calls he used to take in the kitchen or the living room, out in the open, that he now took in the garage with the door shut. When she asked him about it, he said it was work stuff, insurance clients who called at odd hours, nothing worth discussing over the dinner table. And that might have been the whole story, if it weren't for the fact that Richard's job didn't actually require evening calls. Angela knew that better than anyone, because she'd spent 9 years listening to him complain about the predictable 9-to-5 monotony of claims adjusting. Insurance companies do not call their adjusters at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. She let it go, though. We both did. Marriages have small mysteries. Not every locked door is hiding a body. 6 months after that phone call, I came to visit for Zora's birthday, and that's when the receipt happened. Richard had gone out to grab extra ice for the cooler, and when he came back in, he took off his jacket and tossed it over a kitchen chair, and something slipped out of the inside pocket and drifted under the table. I picked it up without thinking, the kind of automatic helpful motion you make 100 times a day without registering it, and I was about to hand it back to him when I glanced at it, only because it was in my hand, and my eyes just happened to land there. It was a receipt from a gas station 3 hours away, in a town I'd never heard of, dated 4 days earlier, at 11:47 at night. Richard had told Angela that week that he'd been at a work conference in the opposite direction. I remember standing there holding that little strip of paper for maybe 2 seconds too long enough that when I looked up, Richard was watching me with an expression I can only describe as carefully blank. Not surprised. Not embarrassed. Blank. The way a person's face goes blank when they are working very hard to control it. I handed it back to him and said something like, "Drop this." And he said thanks. And that was it. Nothing else happened that night. But something in me had shifted, and it never shifted back. If you've ever felt that, the moment your body knows something before your mind is ready to admit it, comment below and tell me. Because I think that instinct is more common and more reliable than we give it credit for. I didn't say anything to Angela that night. I told myself it wasn't my business, that maybe there was an explanation, that maybe I was building a house out of a single brick. But over the following weeks, I found I couldn't let it go. I started replaying small things from years of family gatherings, moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but that now sat differently in my memory. The way Richard had always steered conversations away from his childhood, redirecting with a joke or a quick change of subject whenever anyone asked about his parents, or where exactly up north he was from. The way he had no old friends at the wedding, not one person from before he met Angela, no groomsmen who'd known him longer than a year or two. At the time, I'd chalked it up to shyness, or to loss. A man who'd lost his parents young might not have kept old friendships. But now, held up next to a gas station receipt from a town he wasn't supposed to be in, that absence of a past started to look less like grief and more like a blank space someone had deliberately left blank. About 2 months later, I decided to do something I am not proud of, and something I would do again in a heartbeat, because I believe it may have saved my sister's life. I decided to look Richard up properly. Not the surface Google search Angela had presumably done 9 years earlier when they first started dating, but a real search. I want to pause here and tell you, if you're the kind of person who notices things too, who feels a pull toward a small inconsistency that everyone else waves off, trust that pull. Comment below if you've ever acted on a hunch like that, because I need to know I'm not the only one who does this. I started with the basics. His full name, Richard Andrew Boyd, his stated hometown, his listed age. And here's where the ground started to shift under me in a way I could not unfeel. There was no public record, not one, of a Richard Andrew Boyd matching his age and description having grown up in the town he claimed. No yearbook photo, no old social media account, not even a deleted one I could find cached anywhere. No trace of a childhood. Adults who grew up in small towns leave digital footprints even if they never meant to. Old MySpace pages, tagged photos from cousins, local newspaper mentions from a high school football game. Richard Boyd had none of that. It was as if the first 30 years of his life before Angela had been erased, or had simply never existed under that name at all. I sat with that discovery for 3 days before I told anyone, and during those 3 days I barely slept, because I kept turning over the two possibilities in my head. Either Richard Boyd was an intensely private man who had, for reasons of his own, scrubbed his past from the internet, which people do, especially people who've been through something traumatic they don't want dug up. Or Richard Boyd was not his real name at all. I know how that sounds. I know how it sounded even to me, sitting in my own kitchen at 2 a.m. with my laptop open and my hands shaking slightly around a mug of tea gone cold. But once that second possibility entered my mind, I could not make it leave. If you're still with me, if this is the kind of story that keeps you up at night in a good way, drop a comment telling me where you're watching this from, because I read every single one. And knowing you're out there keeps me digging into stories like this one. I decided the safest next step was not to confront Richard, and not yet to alarm Angela, but to talk to someone who might actually know how to trace a person properly. I have a cousin, Denise, married to a man named Corey, who used to work private investigation before he moved into corporate security consulting, and I called him under the guise of just curious, hypothetically. Corey, God bless him, saw through that in about 4 seconds, but he indulged me anyway. He explained that a person legally changing their name leaves a paper trail, court records at minimum, in whatever state or county the change was filed. It's not invisible, but it's not easy to find casually either, especially if you don't know where to look, and especially if the person changed their name a long time ago, in a place far from where they live now. He told me if I really wanted to know, I needed either a name to search against or a location and rough time frame, and ideally both. I had neither. What I had was a gas station receipt from a town 3 hours away, and a gut feeling that had kept me up for 3 nights running. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I asked Angela gently if Richard had ever mentioned any town by that name, the one on the receipt, and she said no, never, not once in 9 years. I asked her, even more gently, whether Richard had a storage unit anywhere, separate from the house, and she looked at me strangely and said yes. Actually, he did. Out past the edge of town. Something he'd had since before they were married, that he used for old work files and some of his late parents' belongings. She'd never been inside it. In 9 years of marriage, Angela Boyd had never once seen the contents of a storage unit her husband had maintained the entire time she'd known him. When she told me that, something cold moved through my chest. Because a man who tells you he has nothing from his childhood except some boxes in a storage unit he never lets you see is not a man with nothing to hide. He's a man with exactly one thing to hide, kept in exactly one place. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I asked Angela for the address of the storage facility, telling her I wanted to help Richard sort through some of it sometime, make it a family project, something warm and generous sounding that she had no reason to doubt. She gave it to me without a second thought, because that is the kind of trust that exists inside a family, the kind of trust I was, in that moment, using against my own sister for what I told myself was her own protection. If you think that makes me a bad person, say so in the comments. I can take it. But I would do it again, because 3 weeks later I would understand exactly what that storage unit had been protecting. I didn't go alone. I brought Corey, because I am not stupid, and because whatever was in there, I wanted a witness who wasn't emotionally involved and who might understand what he was looking at better than I would. We went on a Thursday afternoon, while Richard was supposedly at work, and Angela was at the kids' school pickup. And I want you to understand that my hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the spare key Angela had given me years earlier, just in case. A key to a unit she'd never once used, for a life she thought she fully knew. The lock stuck for a moment before it gave, and when that metal door rolled up, the first thing that hit me wasn't fear. It was dust, and the particular smell of a space that has been sealed and undisturbed for a very long time. boxes stacked 3 and 4 high, along both side walls. An old dresser, a couple of framed pictures wrapped in newspaper that looked decades old, and near the back, half hidden behind a stack of boxes marked in faded marker, with a name that was not Richard Boyd. The name on those boxes was Daniel Cole. I remember the exact sensation of reading that name, a kind of vertigo, like the floor of the storage unit had tilted a few degrees without actually moving. Corey saw it too, and he was quiet in the way careful people go quiet when they realize a situation has become more serious than they expected. We opened the nearest box, and inside were photographs, dozens of them, some faded, some more recent, of a man who was unmistakably Richard, 10, maybe 15 years younger, standing next to a woman I had never seen in my life, in front of a house I did not recognize, in a town whose name meant nothing to me at the time, but would come to mean a great deal very soon. In several of the photos, the woman was pregnant. In one, she was holding a newborn, and Richard, Daniel, was standing beside her with his arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling the particular exhausted, radiant smile of new parents. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it in that dusty storage unit with my cousin's husband standing silently beside me. My sister's husband of 9 years, father to my niece and nephew, had an entire previous life, a wife, possibly a child, that he had never once mentioned in nearly a decade of marriage. And he had kept the photographic evidence of that life 10 minutes from the house he shared with my sister, under a lock she had never questioned, for a name she had never heard. If your stomach just dropped reading that, I need you to imagine what it felt like to be standing there in person. And I need you to hit that like button right now, because this story is about to take a turn that I still have trouble believing actually happened to my own family. We found more in the second box, a folded newspaper clipping, brittle at the edges, that made both Corey and me go completely silent. It was a missing person notice, the woman from the photographs. Her name, according to the clipping, was Renee Cole, 29 years old at the time, reported missing by her husband, Daniel Cole, after she failed to return from what he'd described as a weekend trip to visit her sister. The date on the clipping was almost exactly 12 years earlier. There was a small, grainy photo of her alongside the text, the same warm, tired smile from the family photographs, and beneath it, a line that I have not been able to get out of my head since. Last seen leaving the family home on the evening of the 14th. Her husband reported her missing 3 days later. 3 days. Corey pointed that detail out to me immediately, in the flat, careful voice of a man trying not to let his own alarm show. Most husbands, he told me, report a missing spouse within hours, not days. 3 days is either a man who wasn't paying attention to his own wife's whereabouts, or a man who needed those 3 days for something else entirely. I sat down on an overturned box, because my legs would not hold me anymore, and I asked Corey the only question that mattered. Was Renee Cole ever found? He didn't know, not off the top of his head, but he said we could find out, and that we needed to, immediately, before we did anything else, before we said one word to Angela, before we so much as looked at Richard sideways at the next family dinner. If you are the kind of person who needs to know how a story ends before you can breathe easy, comment right now and tell me you're staying until the end, because I promise you, what we found out about Renee Cole changed the entire shape of this nightmare. We left the storage unit exactly as we'd found it, locked it back up, and drove to a coffee shop 2 towns over, so Corey could use his old contacts and databases without me hovering, panicking over his shoulder. It took him less than 40 minutes to find what the local newspaper archive and a couple of records databases could tell us. Renee Cole had never been found. Not a body. Not a trace. Not so much as a confirmed sighting after the night she disappeared. The case had gone cold within about 8 months, as these cases so often do when there's no evidence and no leads, and it had sat, unsolved and largely forgotten for over a decade. Daniel Cole had been questioned by police at the time. Routine, Corey explained, because the spouse is always questioned first. But no charges had ever been filed, no arrest, nothing. He had, according to the last records Corey could find under that name, simply moved away from the area about a year after Renee's disappearance. And then, as far as any public record was concerned, Daniel Cole had vanished too, because Daniel Cole had become Richard Boyd. I need you to understand what it feels like to know that the man who taught your nephew how to throw a curveball, who cried at his own daughter's kindergarten graduation, who had eaten at your table every holiday for 9 years, might have been the last person to see a woman alive before she disappeared off the face of the earth. I didn't cry in that coffee shop, though I probably should have. I went very cold and very quiet instead. The way I imagine people go quiet right before they do something they can't take back. Because now I had a decision in front of me that I had been avoiding making this entire time. What do I do with what I know? Do I go to the police with a decade-old cold case and a name change and a storage unit full of photographs and risk that it's nothing, that Richard had some legitimate reason to leave a painful past behind him, a past that maybe wasn't his fault at all? Or do I sit on it, say nothing, and risk that my sister and her 2 children are living under the same roof as a man capable of making a wife disappear without a trace? If you were me, right now, in that moment, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments, because I have asked myself that question every day since, and I still don't fully know if I made the right call. What I actually did was call my sister and ask her to meet me alone, without the kids, without Richard, at a diner on the far side of town. I told her it was important. I told her to come alone. And I want to tell you honestly that the 20 minutes I sat in that diner waiting for her to arrive were some of the longest 20 minutes of my life, because I had absolutely no idea how to say the words I was about to say to my own sister. No gentle way to tell her that the man she'd built a life with might have built that life on the disappearance of someone else. When Angela walked in, she knew immediately, from my face, that something was badly wrong. She sat down across from me and didn't even take her coat off, just looked at me and said, "Whatever it is, just say it." So I did. I told her everything, the receipt, the search, the storage unit, the photographs, the newspaper clipping, Renee Cole, the name Daniel Cole, the 3 days it took him to report her missing, the fact that as far as any public record showed, Daniel Cole had simply stopped existing right around the same time Richard Boyd had started. I watched my sister's face move through disbelief, then anger. At me, initially, for going through Richard's things, for even suggesting such a thing about her husband, the father of her children, and then, slowly, horribly, into something that looked like recognition. Because Angela, it turned out, had noticed things too over the years. Small things she'd never put together, never let herself put together, because putting them together meant looking directly at something she wasn't ready to see. The way Richard flinched, just slightly, whenever the news covered a missing persons case. The way he'd once, years ago, in a rare unguarded moment after a few drinks, said something about how people don't understand how easy it is for someone to just disappear if the right person wants them to, and then immediately changed the subject and never brought it up again. The way he kept a police scanner app on his phone that he checked more often than seemed normal for a man with no connection to law enforcement. If you have a family member who's ever said something small and strange, something that didn't fit, and you brushed past it because bringing it up felt like too much, comment below, because I think this happens more than any of us want to admit, and I think we owe it to ourselves and the people we love to stop brushing past those moments. Angela didn't sleep that night, and neither did I. We talked until nearly 4 a.m, going back and forth on what to do, terrified of 2 very different outcomes. The outcome where we were wrong, and we blew up a family and traumatized 2 children over a coincidence, and the outcome where we were right, and we did nothing. And something happened to Angela the way something had happened to Renee. In the end, it was Angela who made the decision. And I think it was the bravest thing I have ever watched my sister do. She decided she needed to see the inside of that storage unit for herself, in person, with her own eyes, before she did anything else. Not confront Richard yet, not call the police yet. Just look, herself, at the evidence of the life her husband had never told her about. We went back 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, while Richard took the kids to a soccer game across town, a 2-hour round trip that gave us plenty of time. I watched my sister's hands shake even worse than mine had as she unlocked that same rolling door. And I watched her go through those boxes with a kind of controlled, devastating calm, picking up photograph after photograph of a woman she'd never known existed, a life that had run parallel and invisible alongside the one she'd believed was hers alone. It was in the very back of the unit, behind a final row of boxes we hadn't gotten to on the first visit, that we found something that changed everything again. And this is the part of the story where I need you to brace yourself, because it's the part I still have the most trouble talking about. Underneath a stack of old blankets, we found a small fireproof lockbox, the kind people use for important documents, and it was, unlike everything else in that unit, locked with a combination we didn't have. Corey, who'd come with us this time at Angela's insistence, managed to get it open using a trick he said he'd learned years ago in his investigation days. And inside were 3 things. A birth certificate for a baby girl named Hope Cole, born 9 months before Renee's disappearance, meaning Richard, or Daniel, had a daughter none of us had ever known about. A daughter who would now be about 12 years old, roughly Malik's age. A folded, handwritten letter, undated, in a woman's handwriting that we would later confirm through comparison to old documents was Renee's, that spoke of being afraid, of feeling watched, of not knowing who to trust, that ended abruptly mid-sentence as though she'd been interrupted while writing it, and a set of old, yellowed hospital discharge papers for that same infant, Hope, showing she'd been released not to her mother's custody, but to a relative, an aunt, listed by name, in a city Angela didn't recognize, but that Corey immediately flagged as being nearly 400 miles from where Renee had disappeared. I need you to sit with that for a moment, the way we had to sit with it in that storage unit, because it meant something none of us had considered. There might be a little girl, now a young woman on the edge of her teenage years, somewhere out there, who had grown up without ever knowing what happened to her mother, and possibly without knowing her father was still alive at all, living an entirely different life under an entirely different name, coaching another woman's son's little league team, 400 miles away. If this story has you gripping your phone right now, comment and tell me, because we are getting close to the moment everything came apart, and I promise you, it is not what you expect. Angela made the call to the police that same afternoon, from the parking lot of the storage facility, before Richard had even finished driving home from the soccer game. She gave them everything: the storage unit's location, the boxes, the lockbox, the newspaper clipping about Renee Cole's disappearance 12 years earlier, the birth certificate for a daughter neither of us had known existed. I have never been prouder of my sister than I was in that moment, hearing her voice shake but not break as she explained, calmly and clearly, exactly what we had found, even though it meant potentially destroying her own marriage, her own children's sense of who their father was, everything she had spent 9 years building. Some things matter more than the life you thought you had. Some truths cannot stay buried just because uncovering them is going to hurt. The police asked her not to confront Richard directly, not yet, and to act as normally as possible until they'd had a chance to review the cold case file and coordinate with the department in the town where Renee had originally gone missing. I want you to imagine what the next 4 days were like for my sister, sitting across the dinner table from a man she now believed might have been responsible for another woman's disappearance, making small talk about the kids' homework, watching him kiss Malik and Zora goodnight, all while a criminal investigation was quietly reopening around him. Angela told me later that those 4 days were the hardest of her entire life, harder even than the day she found out, because at least once you know the truth, you know what you're dealing with. In those 4 days, she had to pretend not to know, and pretending, it turns out, is its own particular kind of torture. If you've ever had to keep a face calm while your entire world was falling apart underneath you, comment below, because I want to know I'm not the only one whose family has been through something like this. On the 5th day, 2 detectives came to the house in the early evening while Richard was home, while the kids were, thankfully, at a friend's birthday party that Angela had arranged specifically so they would not be present for whatever happened next. I was there too, at Angela's request. standing in the kitchen doorway while the detectives asked Richard to step outside to answer some questions regarding a cold case out of state. I watched the color drain out of his face in real time, watched 9 years of careful, patient, kind husband performance crack in a matter of seconds. And I want to tell you that what replaced it was not confusion, and it was not innocent surprise. It was recognition. It was the look of a man who has been waiting for 12 years, for a knock on the door he always knew might eventually come. He didn't run. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. He didn't try to flee or fight or deny anything in that first frozen moment. He just stood there in the doorway of the house he shared with my sister, looked back at her once, a long, complicated look that I still can't fully read even now, and said quietly, "I never meant for it to go this far." Angela told me later that those 7 words were somehow worse than any confession could have been, because they weren't a denial, and they weren't a claim of innocence. They were the words of a man who knew, and had always known, exactly what he had done. If you need a moment before I tell you what came out over the following weeks, take it, because I needed several moments myself, and I'm the one who lived through it. The investigation that followed took nearly 2 months to fully unfold, and I'm going to walk you through what we learned, because the full truth turned out to be more complicated, and in some ways more tragic, than even our worst imaginings in that storage unit. Richard, Daniel, had not, as it turned out, killed Renee Cole, at least not directly, not with his own hands, though the full moral weight of what he did do is, in my opinion, not much lighter. Renee had suffered from a severe and untreated mental health crisis in the months before her disappearance, something Daniel had known about and, according to what he eventually told investigators, had felt completely unequipped to handle. Rather than getting her the help she desperately needed, he had, in his own words, made arrangements that involved quietly relocating her, against her full understanding and consent, to a care facility several states away under a different name, separating her from their infant daughter in the process, and telling everyone in their lives, including eventually the police, that she had simply vanished. He had done this, he claimed, because he was afraid of what people would think, afraid of the stigma, afraid that admitting his wife was in crisis would mean admitting he had failed to protect her. Instead of getting her real help through legitimate means, he had made a series of increasingly desperate, increasingly illegal decisions that had ultimately stripped a woman of her autonomy, separated a mother from her newborn daughter, and left a missing persons case unsolved for over a decade, while the truth sat, decaying, in a storage unit 10 minutes from his new life. Renee Cole was found alive. I want you to read that sentence again, because it is, even now, the detail that undoes me most every time I think about this whole story. She was alive, living under a different identity in a long-term care facility across the country, largely unaware of how much time had passed, having been failed catastrophically by the one person who was supposed to protect her. Their daughter, Hope, had been raised by Renee's sister, the aunt listed on those hospital discharge papers, who had been told only that Renee had left and that Daniel had disappeared, and who had spent 12 years raising a little girl with almost no answers about either of her parents. When investigators reunited Renee with her sister, and eventually, carefully, with the daughter she had not seen since infancy, it was, by every account I later heard, one of the most emotionally overwhelming moments any of the detectives involved in the case had ever witnessed. A mother and daughter meeting again after 12 years apart, neither one having known if the other was even alive. Richard was arrested and charged, with fraud, with unlawful confinement, with a list of other charges I won't pretend to fully understand the legal specifics of, charges that are still, as of the time I'm telling you this story, working their way through the courts. Angela filed for divorce within the month. She did not hesitate, not once, though I know a part of her grieved the 9 years, and the man she thought she'd married, because grief and clarity are not mutually exclusive, and my sister has never been anything but clear-eyed once she has all the facts in front of her. Malik and Zora are, understandably, still processing what it means that their father is not the man they believed him to be. And Angela has them both in therapy with a counselor who specializes in exactly this kind of family upheaval, because she is, and has always been, a fiercely protective mother who puts her children's healing above everything else, including her own pain. And here's the detail that I think about more than any other, the one I want to leave you with before I ask you to do something for me. Angela reached out, carefully, through an intermediary, to Renee's sister, once everything had settled enough for that kind of contact to be appropriate. And Malik and Zora now have a connection. Tentative, careful, still being built slowly and gently, to a half-sister they never knew existed. Hope, 12 years old, the same age as Malik, growing up 400 miles away, carrying a story about her own missing mother that turned out to have an ending none of us could have predicted. Two families, connected by a man who told all of them only pieces of the truth, are now, slowly, painfully, trying to figure out what it means to know each other at all. I think about that gas station receipt more than I think about almost anything else in my life now. A single piece of paper, 3 hours from where it should have been, at 11:47 at night. If I had handed it back to Richard without looking, if I had told myself it was none of my business, if I had let that gut feeling pass the way we are so often taught to let gut feelings pass because they feel rude, or paranoid, or disloyal, Renee Cole might still be sitting in that facility today, unaware that her daughter was 12 years old and asking questions about her. My sister might still be married to a man capable of what Richard turned out to be capable of. And somewhere, a little girl named Hope might still be growing up believing both of her parents had simply vanished from the earth, with no one left to tell her the truth. I'm not telling you this story to scare you, though I know parts of it are frightening. I'm telling you this story because I believe, all the way down in my bones, that the people who notice things, the ones who feel a small wrongness and don't talk themselves out of it, the ones who follow one thread even when everyone around them says it's nothing, those people save lives more often than anyone gives them credit for. If something in your own family has ever felt off in a way you couldn't quite name, I am not telling you to go digging through storage units, but I am telling you to trust that feeling enough to ask one more question, to look one layer deeper, because sometimes that one thread is the only thing standing between a family and a nightmare nobody saw coming. If this story affected you even half as much as living through it affected me, I need you to do 3 things before you go. Comment below and tell me the one detail from this story that stuck with you the most. I read every single comment, and I want to know which part hit you hardest. Hit that like button, because it genuinely helps stories like this one reach the people who need to hear them. And subscribe, because this is not the only family nightmare I have lived through or uncovered, and I promise you, the next one I tell you will keep you just as gripped as this one did. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. I'll see you in the next story.